Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. This is Scott Bennett and Michael J. with Truth Unite. It is November 25th, 2015. We are going to be discussing a variety of subjects, but first, before we say anything, let us open up in prayer. Father in heaven, we ask your blessing and strength and protection on this show and program. Bless every word that we say and every thought that we have and every internal analysis of those thoughts and words. And give us grace and wisdom, Father, in Jesus Christ's holy name. Amen. Well, Mike, we are going to be discussing, as you and I brought up earlier, the variety of the things that have been going on around the world, and trying to make sense of it from a intelligence analyst perspective. We are going to be looking at the Paris attacks, looking at the Russian plane that was blown up over Egypt, and the Russian jet fighter that was shot down by Turkey, and Holland, and all of these issues, and trying to make sense of them from a psychological warfare information operations point of view and a countermeasure point of view. How do we counter these attacks? How do we counter them with specifically information operations? Since this is a strategic communication, information operations, psychological warfare battle for the hearts and minds of people, of the average citizen, we need to prepare countermeasures, and we need to understand and analyze these things from that perspective. So that's going to be sort of the theme as we evolve into these subjects, and that'll be interesting. I think this will be a very enlightening educational program, and I'm excited to think and see how our minds and our whole experiences are going to be synthesized into this analysis. But why don't you give us a kickoff and share with what you were thinking about?
I'm thinking about what it means to be an American. America was a different kind of nation when we were growing up, and America right now has come under multiple attacks at multiple levels in almost every part of our life. Our food is under attack. Our water is under attack. Our legal system has been taken over brutally by people who have no interest in real justice, because they've turned our prison system into a for-profit system that's now traded on the New York Stock Exchange. We've watched America, as I've said before, go from Leave It to Beaver to Beavis and Butthead. We've watched America be divided along racial lines, along sexual orientation, along spiritual lines, and along political lines. And we're watching the dialectic in almost every part of our life, where we're being one group set against another. But as I've also said, as an American, that the reality of our orientation as individuals is either, if we're making room for the truth in our lives, if we value our own integrity, then it may be that it takes us a while to understand what's really coming down. Like we say, I may be slow, but I'm not stupid. And Americans understand. We understood from the very beginning that real manhood, real heroism, real leadership, real charismatic take charge individualism was never really about just the lone gunman mentality. It was about leadership. It was about the kind of leaders that were chosen by the men in the American Revolution. They were chosen by their men in the war for between the states. Even then, our nation was being divided with psychological and spiritual programs and the insinuation of a demonized form of Freemasonry. We've come under attack for actually more than 200 years now, especially after the War of 1812, where Washington was burned down and then rebuilt along Masonic lines and under Jesuit control. We need to understand, though, that Americans, because there is a sense of real liberty, and because there are many, many real godly people in America, Christians that aren't deceived by churchianity, Christians that are fleeing the so-called churches because they are tired of the forms of godliness. They're tired for the politically correct way of that's been overthrown our true Christian foundations. We're looking for reality among one another, among ourselves. We're looking for real Christian convictions in men who value truth, in men who value real liberty, and in men and women who are disgusted by the materialism and the insanity and the turning us all into consumers so that people go crazy on their Black Friday forays looking for deals in corporations owned by China. The reality is America, I believe, it's discovering and actually becoming aware that there's a growing, powerful movement among men, real Americans, because we're getting it now. We understand that treason has infected our government at the highest levels. We understand that 9/11 was an inside job. We understand that the police state has actually been hijacking all of our state governments. And now we're looking at the fact that all of the world is looking at us while our government has actually created the ISIS and the ISIL and the Al-Qaeda tragedies all over the Middle East. And what am I saying? Well, Russia and other people, other nations in the world are paying the price for the wickedness that has actually insinuated itself into the highest levels of this government that's been hijacked by a psychopath and his psychopathic handlers. So what we're looking at now is the symptoms of a very terrible, immoral disease that is manifesting in treason and mass murder in other places around the world. And we're realizing that someone like Vladimir Putin seems to have more integrity in his little finger than any person that we find in our Senate, in our Congress, or in the Blight House, or in our courts. And this is resented by the neocon traitors that infest the body politic in Washington, D.C. And what they've actually done is they're inciting the bear. They're actually trying to provoke something that could lead to World War III and terrible disasters. But Mr. Putin, I believe, is being given wisdom, and he's being measured in his responses. And the reality of the internet allowing Americans to get a semi-unfiltered view of what's really going on has allowed people to also identify what plainly seems to be provocations and false flags like the attack on Paris. Back to you, brother.
Well, I liked how you mentioned that Putin and his integrity, and that warrants a little bit of a discussion, because there's a lot of people who listen in and are joining this conversation, this analysis table, and they need to be nourished and helped understand some variables of the equation that we're dealing with on the intelligence level, on the political level, on the military level. And that's what this discussion really is, it's sort of like a Charlie Rose round table in the shadows, and all of the internet community of the people that are smart, the best and brightest, are coming together to share an intelligence analysis. So what we're simply bringing to the table is a humble sharing of where we've been, what we know, and how we are internalizing and analyzing and operationalizing this material. And it's done, of course, not for self-aggrandizement. It's not for title. It's not for money. It's for nothing but the duty to our country and our Constitution. As you and I have said before, we are former military personnel who've been in our own military theaters. You were in Vietnam. I was in Iraqi freedom. And the synthesis of our military experiences has a lot of gravity and a lot of wisdom and a lot of skill sets that the average American doesn't have. but everyone needs to be familiar with and acquire. Every citizen patriot needs to make a very conscious decision to be a citizen patriot warrior. A warrior is not someone who goes out and starts wars. A warrior is someone who doesn't have to start wars because they are ahead of the game. They are leaning forward. They are already aware of their operational environment, aware of the people in their community, aware of what is going on in the world, and they aggressively engage it. Aikido, the martial art, is a great teaching for how we are to intellectually engage the world, I believe, because Aikido, as you're familiar with, Mike, is the martial art that moves into your enemy. It uses your enemy's energy and weight and momentum against him and in your favor. So we need to intellectually engage these issues and these parties in an Aikido sort of fashion, where we move into it in close proximity and we use their momentum and their energy against them. And in a PSYOP perspective, I'll never forget when I went through PSYOP training, the number one thing that was always given to me by Colonel Jones was truth is the strongest PSYOP mechanism. Truth can destroy all black propaganda, all lies, all deception operations. Truth, with the right emotional flavor and the right passion, and the right parsing and discrimination against the different angles of truth, is powerful. It destroys everything against it. So truth is the ultimate psychological warfare weapon, but it has to be, it's sort of like a samurai sword. You know, it starts off in a very big piece of block metal, and then it's sharpened and razored and hammered down into a very perfectly balanced cutting instrument. So we have to take the truth of these environments, the truth of these situations, and craft them and sculpt them and polish them where it can be used with a finesse and a very specific maneuver. You don't just vomit everything out. You are very discriminatory on what you discuss and what you let out. But truth has to be front and center. Otherwise, lies turn against you. Lies poison the well. And that's where we've seen what's happened to America and our political reputation in the world. Lies have poisoned our country's name and reputation and body politic like a festering boil that's never been lanced. And the fools that are in the political parties and in the Congress, and the fools wearing general and admiral egg yolk on their hats and shoulders, the fools that are in the media thinking the more times you tell a lie, people are going to believe it. They have not understood the calculation of how powerful truth is. And I certainly don't mean to sound romantic. I'm just very, very clinical and precise and surgical when I articulate the truth in how it affects human consciousness, how it affects the human spirit. And that's where these dead souls in Washington and the military and in the American media, that's where they've fallen down, because they don't understand the human reaction to truth. And it has to be done with a mix of passion and cold-blooded analysis, cold-blooded calculation as a scientist. But it has to have white-hot passion. There has to be emotion. There has to be visual imagery stimulation to engage the whole body and soul, imagination, sensory overload, if you will, of the target, of the person listening to you. So they are not just thinking about truth, they're thinking, they're feeling, they're spiritually, emotionally being interwoven with it. And that is the key to winning the hearts and minds. We understand that, and we're not manipulating, we're not doing anything other than presenting the truth to people in a very clear, precise, unapologetic, unpolitical correct, impolitical correct, whatever the term would be, way. So, Mike, do you want to respond to that before we jump into some of these truths that we're going to start laying out for people?
Sure. Like you said, there is a human response for truth, but there's also a human response in revulsion for lies. And the American people, people who have held on to their own integrity, are disgusted with the kind of lies and half-truths and deceptions and manipulations that come into almost every part of our life with respect to the mass media, the talking heads, and the kinds of programming that's out there. That's also about constantly attacking the moral standards of our nation and of our ancestors. The reality is that there was nothing wrong with having ancestors that didn't believe in immorality as a right. The reality is that when people notice liars, they also may notice that these people have a very easily movable set of moral standards. And the reality of our hope right now is based on holding on to truth and allowing truth to define us, so that when you and I are seeing the kind of men we encounter, even in the church, who somehow have been allowed, have allowed themselves to don't be too strong in any one issue. They always want to leave themselves wiggle room. They don't want to look at moral absolutes. They want to do something that allows them to be not placed in a position where they have an absolute and they're not going to let go of that absolute. And this, for me, causes a terrible grieving inside, because I've found, and I've seen it in the lives of others, that if you don't have conviction right now in a relative time of peace, but so that you're willing to stand up against the kind of corruption and wickedness and situational ethics that's defining most of our culture, don't even think you're going to find the strength to go along with resisting under martial circumstances, or in times of martial law or real emergency. You're just going to go with the flow. You're going to go into the camps. You're going to abandon your family, because even in a time of peace, you didn't have the courage to stand up for what's right. So our conversation, our dialogue right now is about identifying with conviction that the issues that we're noticing have to be looked at and measured with real moral absolutes, like murder, treason, provocations by our government, blowing up innocent people in that Russian airliner. These kinds of things are acts of war and terrorism, but they're done to provoke. And this is something that every America should take personal responsibility for, in owning their convictions and allowing God to make them a man instead of a sheep. Go back to you, Bennett.
Well, I'm gonna go right into the analysis of the history of this. This is a time, of course, right before Thanksgiving, so you're going to have a lot of people coming into your various orbits of social interaction, your family, you're going to Uncle Joe's, whatever it may be. So this is also a time to begin to educate people in quiet, subtle conversations, and dropping down key words to gauge and also begin to open people up to having these conversations about these subject matters. Of course, the people who listen to this, who tap into the alternative media environment, who participate in some of these Facebook conversations and such, they're already illuminated. They're already sort of officer class, or at least NCO, because they're already aware of the material. They're acclimated to a certain degree of the training. They recognize there's a discipline, there's a martial spirit, a military sort of debriefing environment that we present in this. So the people already tying in, regardless of their religion. I don't care if you're a Baptist, a Catholic, a Muslim, a Buddhist, or a little man from Mars. I don't care what your religious belief is. I don't care what you believe or whether you believe it or not. That's your path. It's between you and God. We, of course, have our own experience, and I'm very open and always sharing it because I believe my own personal experience. It's been an amazing confirmation that God exists and that He's active in the affairs of men. But I never want to preach or evangelize to anyone. This is an intelligence and analyst presentation. This analyzes what's going on in the world from a patriotic, military sort of opinion and filter and attitude, so that people can be educated and strengthened and empowered with the knowledge and with the skills and the templates and the relationships, the other people, so that they can be effective in representing themselves in their local community and making sure that the political representatives of their community are held to task, are reflections of their moral character. Because that's what the American Republican democracy experiment is the moral conscience of the people in this country is supposed to be reflected in the political leadership. We've separated and degenerated to a large degree. So the political leadership is an oligarchical class, an aristocratic class. And of course, in history, some of the most degenerates have been the oligarchs and the aristocratics. The Greeks had a scorn and a disgust for people who didn't, quote, believe in the gods, and that were just all about business or the lusts of the flesh or things like that. The Greek tradition had a scorn and a distrust of those sort of people, and that hasn't changed. The human experience fundamentally hasn't changed. So we see in the Thanksgiving time some things to be aware of, things to be conscious of. Specifically, you've got a time now coming up of parades, the Macy's Day Parade, and that's always entertaining. Then you have, but this is quite different now than what we had in 1945, 1950, when you had the old Natalie Wood, what's the old Natalie Wood Christmas story where Santa Claus comes to town in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, black and white film. This is quite different than that. This is quite different than It's a Wonderful Life with Jimmy Stewart and the whole
Miracle on 34th Street.
Yes, thank you. Miracle on 34th Street. This is different than It's a Wonderful Life, where Jimmy Stewart and the angel and Donna Reed and his 4 or 5 kids, where they're living in a rickety house, but they have love and they have a warm fire and everyone has clothes and foods. They may not have a lot of money, but they do have the heart of God in their family and their smiles and their love for each other. That was a lot different back then. Sadly, we've degenerated from that. We've allowed it. We've surrendered that imagery, that moral character, that institutional family structure, that nuclear family. We've abandoned that. We've allowed it to become decayed and degenerated and rusted, and in most cases, fallen apart. Divorce as easy as a handshake, as signing a piece of paper, and the whole corrosion of the family unit has allowed the corrosion of the political state of America. It's allowed the corrosion of the moral standards of entertainment, which has gotten us into today, where we have all sorts of sexual promiscuity and flamboyance and gay parades and people in high-cut shorts and making all sorts of sexually promiscuous gestures, and their dancing and the music, and on and on and on and on. You can philosophize about the poisonous character of pop culture, and it's led us into a toxic environment today, where you have you can spend hours and hours analyzing, but in a nutshell, you got pornography at every turn, which leads to all sorts of sexual violation of children. You've got the attack on manhood. So most men and fathers are depicted in modern pop culture as bumbling idiots or homosexuals. You've got women tattooed in every place on the body, thinking it's going to make them more attractive, thinking that if they put a tattoo on the lower part of the back, somehow that's going to entertain a man while he's engaging in certain behaviors, rather than having a woman elevated in a sort of Southern Belle charm school where they know how to behave and be feminine and be glorious and radiate with feminine mystique, not to allow it to be poisoned by the Gloria, whatever her name was, the modern feminist. So you've had a lot of degeneration on what was originally very wholesome. So I say that to say we're coming around the Thanksgiving holiday, so you're going to have a lot of people in your sphere of influence. This is a time to be engaging and at the same time very absorbent, very sensitive, and listening and watching very carefully what you see going around you in the pop culture, what you see in the parades, what you see in the football games, what you hear in the conversations. And you really should stand out as a leader of your family and your community by not allowing yourself to become drunk with the entertainment of football games, drunk and stupid with the common mediocrity of conversation that people are talking about nonsense and worthless garbage. If conversation is worth having, have it on a very significant issue. Have it on a serious subject. Have it on something that's going to affect your eternal destiny and the destiny of your children and the national structure they're going to be living in. Talk about the refugee crisis. Talk about the Russian plane that was shot down in Egypt, or blown up in Egypt, actually. Talk about the Russian fighter jet that was shot down by Turkey. Talk about the Turkey nation and the president of Turkey, Erdogan. Talk about its relationship with NATO. Talk about NATO. Is NATO needed? Or does it need a general reconstruction, a reorganization? Talk about Russia. Talk about the United States. Compare Russia and the United States. Talk about Iran. Compare Iran and the Shia Muslim identity with the Saudi Arabian Wahhabist identity. The Wahhabist identity, I know from personal experience, knowledge, and training, is the one that says convert to Islam or die or be a slave. That's the Wahhabist religion. There is no in between. The Shia does not have that. So suddenly you have a big difference, a black and a white, compared to the Muslim identity. You got the Shia, besides the Kurds and the Alawites, but you've got the Shia, which is not condemnatory, not abusive, not destructive of human beings. And then you've got the Wahhabist, Salafist Saudi Arabians, which are very tyrannical. And the Saudi Wahhabists are what are going up into ISIS, going up into Syria, going up into through Turkey, going up into Europe, incidentally, and incidentally also who may be coming over here to the United States by the good ship lollipop of Obama, as he's funneling these people in a refugee resettlement. So those are some of the conversations that people should be writing down and having to wake up your neighbors, wake up your family members. Don't allow yourself to be put to sleep, because that's what the popular culture is really trying to do. It's trying to put people into a sense of confusion and at the same time submitting to the higher opinions of the liberal media and the powers that be in the Obama administration and the CIA and some of these information operation groups. So, Mike, I'll let you jump in there, and then I want to start on a analysis of what sort of conversations people can be having. Over to you.
Yes. We're going to be covering. Did you turn off the mic? There you go. We're going to be covering the downing of the Russian fighter, the fact that they were the people on the ground were actually firing on these pilots coming down as they were parachuting. The fact that ISIS and Erdogan have been in partnership for probably more than a year now, and that they've been using the trail from Benghazi over to Turkey. That's why the ambassador was killed, because he was part of shipping the arms over to Turkey to fund ISIS and ISIL over there. The fact that Russia was literally doing what it was requested to do by the lawful government in Syria, and Turkey was contending for where the lines, that is the boundaries of the original Syrian government that Syria wanted to protect, but Turkey had actually advanced way beyond the original lines, and Russia was actually flying their planes over the real borders of Syria when it was attacked. And Turkey knows this. They don't want to bring it into the conversation, into the dialogue, but this was an intentional act of murder against Russian planes. And so it's very interesting that they went first to NATO in order to maybe get their backside covered and protected, because they were doing what they felt their masters wanted them to do. We're going to be talking about these different nations and the psychological operations that have been previewed in Europe that may be coming here to America in this season, because we've always seen that for the best, the greatest impact, that the enemies of America want to use the things that Americans consider sacred as opportunities to present terror. This is something we need to pray about. The reality is that we're watching also that this monster in the Blight House has decided to prevent a standard of living increase, the necessary standard of living increase in Social Security, and cut the budget for the VA with respect to taking care of our own veterans and our own homeless, so that they can fund bringing tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of these Islamic invaders into America, disguising them as refugees. This is just the beginning, but we need to start somewhere, brother. So why don't you begin?
Well, let's start off from the very beginning. And this is an example of the conversation that people should be beginning to familiarize themselves with and relate to other people, other human beings. And remember, people who have not been enlightened about these conversations and these subjects, they're still asleep. They're still in the matrix, if you will, of the popular culture reference. When you start questioning and bringing out the fact that, all right, if we go back, first of all, everyone today who's going to be gathering around the Thanksgiving table or in these social settings over the holidays for the next few months, they're all going to be very, very nervous and talking about what's going on in the world. And a lot of people will not be able to make sense of it. They will not be able to put the pieces together, largely because they've been dumbed down in this country for the past 20 years, largely because they're so confused and scatterbrained and their minds are in 5 different directions at once. I've got to get Christmas paper wrapping, I've got to get candles, I've got to get food, I've got to go to this party and this cookie, and I've got to engage in all sorts of leisure activities. So there's very little substance. And you and I have seen that when we've gone to some of the church establishments and engaged people. There's nothing there. It's gelatin. There's no toughness. There's no fortitude. There's a silly, weak, limp-wristed, half-witted, glossy-eyed personality, which is very sad to me. But at the same time, we have to be aware of the environment that we live in, and we have to call people out to be strengthened and be straighten up and toughen up. And yeah, our military experience gives us a particular sensitivity to basic training, and we understand that you have to get the basics of character and discipline and intensity down before you go on to your advanced individual training. So you'll have to learn how to start, learn how to stand, learn how to march, learn how to look, learn how to think, and then you move on into applying those skills into advanced operations, advanced training, advanced targeting. So the basic training that people need to, one, have gone through themselves, which we've, for the past few months, we've tried to do that, giving people a sort of what's the word, osmosis, or an osmotic sort of training themselves by participating in these conversations. Hopefully people have intuitively toughened up and sharpened their brain. But the basic training that they've gone through is what they need to give to their friends and family and neighbors in these environments. And even if it's just writing down the website, writing down the subjects, like shell game, everyone who hasn't, everyone who cares about the country and cares about the subject that we discuss should be reading and familiar with the shell game material, which is the analysis of the Swiss banking, terrorist financing connection to Edward Snowden, Brad Birkenfeld, UBS, Union Bank of Switzerland, HSBC, Hillary Clinton, Eric Holder, Lanny Brewer, President Obama, and various members of Congress, and various members of the military, and various members of the media. That whole analysis was the whistleblowing report that went up to Congress and the military in 2012. And that has been front and center of this whole unfolding of the ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Middle Eastern refugee operations, Benghazi, and running guns into the destabilization of Syria. Shell game was at the heart of all that because it involves the Swiss bankers, it involved the missing 28 pages, it involves the Saudi Arabians, the Kuwaitis, the Qataris, the Gulf nation Wahhabists versus Iran. So Shell Game by Scott Bennett can be Googled and it'll take you to the material. That right there is what people should give to their friends and neighbors to begin the conversation, to wake people up, to slap them awake, to throw a bucket of cold water on their face. So suddenly they are brought back to reality. Suddenly there's a seriousness. So Shell Game can be helpful in that, as well as, you know, a lot of other material that's very useful, like Susan Lindauer's book and Barbara Honegger's book. Barbara Honegger's was October Surprise. She also does a fabulous presentation on the Pentagon attacks, Behind the Smoke Curtain. Susan Lindauer's Extreme Prejudice. So there's a lot of good material that people need to be aware of. But I would say the start of the conversation is on September 11th, 2001, the world changed forever. And it changed out of a false flag. It was a false attack. It was a false Pearl Harbor. We were led to believe at the time that a bunch of Saudi Arabian savages had somehow jumped onto a plane and crashed into the World Trade Center, crashed into the Pentagon, and started a war. And we found out 10 years later that it was all false. It was all fake, and that the official explanation of why the Twin Towers went down and what happened to the Pentagon, the official story about all that is physically impossible. And it's been proven as such. Rebecca Roth's work and countless others, again, Judy Woods, has proven that 2 airplanes did not crash into the World Trade Center and melt them and destroy them. It was something else. And just stick to the basics. It was not 2 airplanes taking down the World Trade Center. The Pentagon was not hit by a plane. I know that for a fact because I drove by the Pentagon the next day because I was going up to Catholic University every day for my doctorate. And I drove by and there was no burned grass and there was no plane parts, and it was not a plane that took the building down. And then that was reaffirmed in my discovery of Barbara Honegger's material some 10 years later. And it's sad and shameful that it took 10 years to fall and discover this, but I was a military member. I drank the Kool-Aid, and I had also been the victim, like all the other Americans, of trauma-based mind control. They traumatize you to make you, follow the herd, follow the false narrative, follow the fake lie that America had been attacked by guys on planes, and that was false. Incidentally, the same trauma is what they use when they get you in court situations when you're charged with by federal prosecutors with something. You're traumatized because you're honestly believing it's all about justice. And if you're innocent, you're honestly believing that the system is going to reveal your innocence. And at the end of the day, justice and innocence will prevail, and you really don't need to, do anything. And that's another example of trauma that the government actors and the prosecutors use against people. And I know that firsthand too. But the beginning of the conversation is the 9/11, September 11th attacks that occurred in Washington, D.C. and the Pentagon and New York. And from that attack, suddenly the Patriot Act was born, miraculously, suspiciously, within a matter of weeks. Of course, it had been prepared before that, but suddenly, after the September 11th attacks, then you had the Patriot Act. Incidentally, during the September 11th attack, you had Dov Zakheim, my boss, incidentally, and $2.3 trillion missing from the Pentagon, which Don Rumsfeld had mentioned the day before on September 10th. So now you start to have all these suspicious, strange, smelling sort of weird things that were going on, and weird people and weird connections. And you see the Bush connections to the Carlyle Group and Booz Allen Hamilton, and the World Trade Center towers being owed by Larry Silverstein, who was connected with the Israeli Mossad, who was a dual citizen, incidentally, American and Israeli. And now you have all these other Israeli Mossad Zionist types like Pearl and Wolfowitz and Dov Zakheim and other strange people suddenly coming together. And there's a lot of powerful detective work that's already been done. But all of that led us up into this war that we were geared to. Michael Chertoff as well, the attorney general at the time, who shuttled away 5 dancing Israelis back to Israel. These 5 Israelis that were seen and caught on a van dancing when the World Trade Center towers were taken down, and then said to the arresting officer, well, our enemies are the same. We're not your enemies. Our enemies are the same, meaning the Arab Muslim and the Palestinians and all that. Well, that should have been a red flag right there. And yeah, you're right, Michael Chertoff, who owned the airport scanners that we now see at every turn. So we see Michael Chertoff and all of these people. We see the crime scene of New York City, all the metal and everything supposedly not analyzed, not given any sort of forensic scientific chemical analysis. And that was proven also with Susan Lindauer's friend who was in Japan, and she was arrested because she had taken back some metallurgy to be analyzed. So there's a lot of strange things that were going on. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time going back into the 9/11, just to simply suffice it to say that 9/11 was the starting point for where we are now. 9/11 was the beginning of the tsunami. Then we go into Afghanistan and say that Osama bin Laden was alive until, 2011, they said he was killed, where other people and researchers have said, no, Osama bin Laden was dead in 2003, I think that was the year. Besides the Al-Qaeda, CIA as a instrument for waging war against the Russians and all that. So it wasn't like this Indian tribe of Muslims were gathering like a perfect storm, and suddenly when they hit critical mass, they launched an attack against the United States. That's what they tried to make Americans believe, and that's what they believed initially. But the more you begin to analyze the history and the research and the truth and the evidence, you see that was not the case. There was no such thing. These individuals, if they existed at all, were really part of a U.S. CIA, Mossad intelligence mercenary force. But then we go up into Afghanistan, and then after Afghanistan, suddenly we implement George W. Bush's plan to destabilize Iraq. Now, it's worth noting when Bush came into office, and I voted for him, I was a conservative, and I thought he was too. But when he walks into office, the first thing he does is start to initiate, how do I get rid of Saddam Hussein? Invent a way for me to do it. Not what do the American people want, not if we remove him, how much damage will that do? Will there be good, or will there be more damage caused? Not any of that. It was a selfish mind control agenda of how do I get rid of Saddam Hussein and go into Iraq. Susan Lindauer in her material has confirmed this, as others have. And then we start the beginning of a false flag. And the false flag started with a lot of training and materials that were distributed throughout the Pentagon and the military that were redefining and commercializing and advertising the Pearl Harbor theory and airplanes into the Pentagon, airplanes used as weapons in building attacks. That was all way before 9/11. They were talking about it. They lied later on when they said they didn't know anything about it. But the fact is, from January of 2001 till September 11th, they were cultivating this whole mind psyop. And Susan Lindauer has talked about that too, and her various engagements with the Iraqis as having nothing to do with 9/11. But then we see the 9/11 attacks. Suddenly we go into Afghanistan. Next thing we go into Iraq. And Iraq, we go in, we dismantle the entire country, and we make it impossible. We de-Baathize the country. So everyone who is in the Ba'ath Party is forbidden from earning a paycheck and feeding their family. They're forbidden from any government jobs. So that entire Ba'ath Party element now begins to be isolated and alienated from the Paul Bremer Iraq American government. And I know for a fact, because I was in the Bush administration when we were sending people over and trying to get the government up and running, they were doing this either the most stupid political experiments, or they were purposely doing stupid political experiments, knowing that they were going to fail and they're going to cause chaos and corruption and disintegrate the country. So everything the Bush administration did was chalked up to either supreme ignorance and arrogance or supreme corruption and wickedness, because they fell into building a boat with a screen door on the bottom and it sank, or they purposely did it knowing it was going to sink so it could advance their larger term agenda. But then we've got the isolation of the Iraqi Ba'ath Party, and that begins to foment into what we have today, which is a Wahhabi ISIS mercenary perfect storm that's been gathering. And now we have this storm that's now been used to carve out a land area between Syria and Iraq that is currently our focus of kinetic operations. And that'll lead us into part two, which is analyzing where we are now in relation to Europe and Russia and Turkey and the United States. But Mike, I'll let you jump in.
Okay, brother. After the Air Force had that exercise on 9/11, so that there was no covering over Washington and over the northeastern part of the United States, it's kind of amazing that Osama bin Laden somehow knew, quote unquote, about our exercise, so there was no air cover to handle these so-called jets that were driven in to the buildings, where, by the way, there were 2 jets supposedly driven into the buildings, flown into the buildings, but then a 3rd building came down, Building 7. Please go to YouTube and put down Building 7 and see what happens when an office fire on a couple of floors brings that whole building down at the speed of gravity. And this is supposedly what? It doesn't even make sense They knew when it was coming down. They evacuated the building. There was no way that that could have come down without explosives in it. And this is the smoking building, if you will. But the fact is that they introduced after this um, missiles going against Afghanistan so that they could, quote, take out the Taliban and go in there. And now the American government, the CIA, and the Mossad had direct access to all the opium fields in Afghanistan, and they still are in control of them. We have military protecting those fields, and it's the largest opium field industry in the whole world, worth trillions and trillions of dollars on the black market. So also remember, they were looking for yellow cake in Iraq. They never found any weapons of mass destruction. That woman, Plame, who was a CIA asset, was outed with respect to her her husband's report. She was outed by a traitor in the United States government. And then the United States justified going in and murdering hundreds of thousands of innocent Iraqis. This whole second Iraq war was a campaign of mass murder against an innocent nation so that they could continue the plan that they had years before to take out all the so-called enemies of Zionist Israel for the greater Israel plan. And Americans need to wake up, because we were led into this war by people who pretend to be Christians in America, leading the Christian Zionist voting bloc to say, go, let's get rid of those dirty Muslims. They're the enemies of the chosen people of God. This is the most disgusting propaganda manipulation of the American people in the whole history, because there was no truth in it at all. And these people that pretend to be God's chosen people are, by the Bible, defined as wicked monsters, because the Lord himself said, you will know God's people by their fruit, not by their roots. A lot of people were true Israelites who were actually overthrown by the Lord himself because they stood up for their religion. They rejected their Messiah, and their temple and their city was brought down around their their ears, and they claimed to be God's chosen people. It hasn't changed. Back to you, brother.
Well, the other part of the analysis is the role of the Israel nation and who we have in Israel now, and the delusion which has afflicted the American Christian mind for 100 years. And the delusion, the fruit of that delusion, we see now throughout all of these televangelists and megachurch type of people that are on the TV. And I know John Hagee, for example. I know him personally. I remember him coming out when I was a young man in my early days of college, and meeting him, and a lot of what he said and he preached about, I enjoyed hearing. But 10, 15, 20 years later, I've seen this degeneracy into this blind obedience and subservience to Israel and the Israeli policies, and I've seen it in other evangelical leaders. I mean, the majority of them have all jumped aboard this bandwagon that Israel in the Christian myth, Israel in the last days, and all the world will come against them, and God will save his people, and all this nonsense that leads the American Christian church establishment into a blind subservience and worship and defense of Israel and everything that they do, regardless of how heinous, cruel, or immoral or illegal it is. There is this blindness, this lobotomization that causes these American churches to, quote, stand with Israel, stand and defend Israel, Israel above all costs, Israel is our closest ally in the Middle East, and blah, 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 blah. That I think now, in really researching this whole subject matter, I've come to the conclusion that's That's a complete lie. That's completely false. That's a perversion of the Bible. It's a perversion of the entire biblical Christian plan of salvation, because there is no believer, unbeliever, and Israelite, believer, unbeliever, and Jew. That is not the case. In the American Christian experience, there is the believer, which were the Jews, and then in the time of Christ, there was everybody who accepted Christ, and that was all the Jews before Christ. And then after Christ's death and resurrection, every human being who he enters into their heart and gives salvation through his blood and his sacrifice. And that's a personal experience. That's not dependent on the church you go to. It's not dependent on how much money you give in the basket. It's not dependent on what you eat and what you don't eat. It's dependent on nothing except God himself bringing repentance to a man's heart, and bringing the acknowledgement that there is one name under heaven by which man can be saved. No man cometh to the Father but by me. And God draws men unto himself. And there are those he draws and those that are not. And that includes Jews, it includes blacks, whites, Mexicans, Asians, every human flesh on the planet. And then there's the human flesh on the planet that is regenerated, that is resurrected. And that's God's business. That's a personal experience that every man has to follow. But politically, in the life of the United States, we've gone down this false trail that's led us into giving complete, absolute support and obedience to everything Israel's done, and also being blind to the mischievousness, blind to the arrogance and racial intolerance and deceit that a lot of the Zionist personalities and the Zionist political figures and the Mossad political operators have engaged in against this country, against Europe. Alan Saprosky and others, and Susan Lindauer's boss at the CIA, they all said Israel, Mossad, the Zionists, had their fingers all over the 9/11 attacks. How many Americans understand that and have looked at that? Very few. But they need to, because it's the truth. And that's the only thing that matters at the end of the day. What is the truth? The truth and the whole truth and nothing but the truth. And people need to fearlessly and intelligently begin to analyze all this material. So you have the Israeli engagements in these false flag attacks against the United States to trigger the United States into a war, and Netanyahu stepping up saying every war that Israel is basically in is the United States war. So now you have dual Israeli citizens in Congress making laws and starting wars that the American family is being dragged into fighting. And that's what happened in Iraq, Afghanistan. And you've got veterans coming back from the wars, knowing that it was false, knowing that it was a lie, knowing that it was fabricated. And as a result of that, have been traumatized, have been wounded. A lot of them don't have the ability to cope and understand and deal with a post-traumatic stress, so they kill themselves, they get drugged out of their minds, they get become alcoholics, all sorts of things. Those are the veterans that we have neglected, that have been subject to these false flag wars. So Israel plays a very strong part, and it's not being, I'm not going to fall into the stupidity of being called anti-Semitic or anything, because I'm not at all, and anyone who has any brains understands the Christian position is to be kind and truthful and loving to all mankind. But the principalities and powers and governments of the world need to be analyzed very clearly, and that includes the Israeli Mossad operatives that we have in Israel, as well as Saudi Arabia and the closeness that they are working. Now we see in the the ISIS operations. Israel has provided hospitals and healing and ambulance services to ISIS fighters. ISIS fighters and this whole ISIS component has been used and funded and given arms by the American establishment to move up into Syria. And Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Kuwait have all been pushing to penetrate Syria. And Russia has stepped in now because they recognize if Syria goes, then it's going to come right into Russia. Then you're going to have the second phase of that will be to push into Russia and begin to destabilize Russia and trying to do another Ukrainian coup d'etat, which the United States did in Ukraine. So Russia's not tolerating that, and they've stepped in to do a countermeasure. Now, I know Russians, I know Ukrainians, and they're wonderful people. They're very salt of the earth, godly people. I've never seen anything but virtue out of them. Yes, we all have our flaws and peculiarities of culture, but as a whole, they're very wholesome people. And that is what the American personality needs to come to awareness of, that they have more in common with Russia than they do with Israel and Saudi Arabia and the rest of these Wahhabist Middle East cultures, peoples, and governments. And the American people need to ideologically ally with Russia and support it in this counterterrorism operation. And that means impeaching and removing Obama by whatever legal means necessary, and all other members of Congress, which have been pursuing this rabid anti-Russian insanity, including Lindsey Graham and Marco Rubio and John McCain and Dianne Feinstein and all these other clowns and traitors. And I can say absolutely, I know Marco Rubio should hang because he got my report on terrorist financing and did nothing, as did Dianne Feinstein and John McCain and Lindsey Graham and Howard Buck McKeon and Ron Johnson and his staff, who I've put up on the videotape. All of those people have been educated about the terrorist funding that has been coming through the Gulf nations into the Wahhabist ISIS elements. So the Russians have stepped in, and what we see now is because Russia has stepped in, they've had a jetliner blown up by someone throwing an explosive into the luggage compartment. So it was probably someone in the airport profession. And then Russia has stepped up and basically destroyed in a couple months more enemies and infrastructure and weapons than the United States has been able to destroy in 2 years. So Russia has actually come in and doing what should be done, while the U.S. has been lying to the American people. And that's what Americans need to wake up to, is they've been lied to, they've been fooled, they've been treated like cattle, and the elite enlightened political figures in Washington who get elected to office and bribed and paid by the American-Israeli Political Action Committee, and because of their dual citizenship sympathies, have led us into this war against Russia. And it's very close to triggering, because you had the Paris attacks that just occurred, where Webster Tarpley had come on and said, it's not a false flag, it's a state-sponsored flag terrorist attack. And Ole Damengard had said that it is a false flag attack, and there's all sorts of false artificial creations and a lot of funny business with the Paris attacks. So that's yet coming out. But the bottom line is it was an attack that was prepared for and understood ahead of time, because there were drills that were going on in Paris. I know I had reported to the French intelligence all the Swiss banking terrorist financing elements 8 months prior, and they never did anything. They refused to debrief me. And in fact, Saudi Arabia paid the French $300 million soon after I had conversations with the French intelligence officer, which I also put on YouTube. So you had the Paris attacks, and the what preceded the Paris attacks, of course, were the refugees their exodus from the Syrian battle space. All these people from Syria and North Africa, Nigeria, all these young military men, single men, flooding into Europe through Turkey into the heart of Germany. And all of Europe now is suffering from all this poison that's been coming in. And I say poison because they're not looking to strengthen the nations of Europe. They're looking to degenerate, corrupt, and bleed them and cause them to be absorbed into their Islamic Wahhabist culture and identity. They're not looking to become good little Dutchmen, good little Brits, good Swedes, good Germans. No, they are coming in to make those countries subservient and absorbed by their Wahhabist religion and ideology by choice or by conquest. Those are the only two choices that they have. And if they fight back, if they refuse, then they're going to be blown up or killed or raped or things like that. So the Europeans are between a rock and a hard place. And all of these refugees and these invaders had come into Europe, and suddenly you have the Paris attacks. And the Paris attacks has now quickened NATO into a posture against, quote, ISIS, and they've been positioning themselves to, quote, go against ISIS. But the big suspicion is they're not going to go against ISIS. They're going to go against Assad, because ISIS is Turkey. It is Saudi Arabia. It is the Gulf nations. That's what ISIS is. So Europe, not the people of Europe, mind you, but the political power bureaucrats of the European Union are positioning NATO to try and go against Assad and destabilize it and go against Russia. So now you have Hollande, President Hollande of France, come over to the United States, meet with Obama, and on the same day you have a Russian fighter plane shot down by a Turkish fighter plane or missile. I've seen two different reports, but if it was a fighter plane taking down a Russian bomber because Russia was supposedly in Syria's airspace, that's an act of war. Never mind the fact that Putin has said, no, the Russian plane was not in Turkish airspace. It was in Syrian airspace. But putting that to the side, even if the Russian bomber was in Syrian Turkish airspace, it is still unacceptable and an act of war for Turkey to shoot down that Russian plane, because they know for a fact that Russian operations are engaged in anti-ISIS counterterrorism operations. So they know that the Russian plane was not coming into Turkey. It was not going to bomb Turkey. It was bombing ISIS terrorists in Syria. And the Turks knew that. So the Turks, by attacking Russia, destroying the Russian plane, have supported and provided air defense to the terrorists that the entire American people and the entire European people hate and want destroyed. Let me say that again. Every American citizen and every European citizen wants the terrorist ISIS Wahhabist destroyed, because they don't want Yazidi women or any other women being raped and turned into sex slaves. They don't want little children beheaded. They don't want this Wahhabist death cult spreading like a cancer, locusts, beyond that area, beyond Syria and the Middle East. They don't want that. For that reason, the European and the American public have been saying, we want them destroyed. We want ISIS contained. We want whatever it takes. But that's not what happened. The American and the Turkish and quite possibly the European elite political leaders have lied to the people and done completely the opposite. They have protected and funded these ISIS Wahhabist terrorists, and they've done so, as Turkey just showed, by their true colors. Turkey stepped up and shot down the Russian plane right after Putin had announced that at the G20 summit, many of these G20 countries have been financing the terrorist ISIS operations. And when he did that, soon after, the plane was shot down. And Turkey, incidentally, rushed right over to the United Nations, went to NATO, wrote a letter to NATO, crying and pleading for protection because they had just shot down a Russian plane. And also what happened, as the Russian pilots are descending in parachutes, these Turk men, okay, Turkish men, were shooting machine guns up at the descending pilots. So these men are coming down in parachutes, defenseless, and these Wahhabi Turkish savages are shooting machine guns up at the descending pilots. Symbolically, they're shooting machine guns at every Russian citizen, at every American citizen, and at every European citizen. They're shooting machine guns at the peaceful Americans, Europeans, and Russians, as well as the Iranians, as well as the Chinese, as well as anyone who is not a member of the Wahhabi death cult. They're shooting machine guns at you. So the question now becomes, are you going to be shot, or are you going to surrender, or are you going to fight back? And if you fight back, you have to destroy them. You don't fight back and call a timeout. You fight back and destroy them. And if you're going to fight back and destroy them, then you have to ally with Russia, because that's exactly what they're doing. Mike, did you want to jump in?
Yes, brother. The thing is, our Congress and Senate seems to be filled with the neocons that claim to be enlightened because they hypocritically say that they are standing for self-determination in nations when most of the Syrian people do not want them there. Most of the Syrian people have been made homeless by these people who were pretending to defend their right to own their own country, so they destroyed it right out from under them. This hypocrisy only works on people who are spiritually and morally blind and stupefied by being addicted to the kind of propaganda that comes from the bobblehead boobs that inhabit the mainstream media. And the reality is that the false flag that happened in Paris is now being used as a spiritual, psychological leverage to introduce martial law. And they've now put about 10,000 plus NATO and let's see, European Union troops in the cities of Britain, so-called fighting against terrorists. Now, what terrorists are they fighting against? Are they willing to admit that they've allowed hundreds of thousands and maybe more than 1 million Islamists into Great Britain? No. They're fighting against the possibility of British people starting to resist the monsters that have been ghettoizing their cities and making it absolutely unsafe for British policemen and British citizens to go into their ghettos because they're using Sharia law there, doing their honor killings there, raping women there. And the reality is, this is an invasion. It's a stealth invasion, and only real embracing honesty is going to be, and the truth is going to be able to resist this kind of treason in the people that have actually sold out their own citizens in all of these European Union nations and in the United States. So I'm very grateful that in a person like Vladimir Putin, who is absolutely loved by most of the people in Russia, he actually speaks from a heart that reveals integrity and honest raging against wicked people who just committed this murder and who blew the Russian airline out of the sky and murdered innocent people. These are war crimes, okay? This can't be tolerated by any civilized nation. If Vladimir Putin was in America, I would vote for him for president, better than the dirtbag that pretends to be an American that's in there now. That's Mike, brother.
Mike, let's pick that up, because we were talking about that before. The Putin regime in Russia really needs to aggressively engage in a psychological warfare, information operations, strategic communications plan by by basically constructing messages that get out to the people of the United States and the people of Europe and the European countries that begin to ally the hearts and minds of the American people and the European people with the Russian people. And Vladimir Putin is already symbolic for the Russian people. Russia is very, very bound together in their love for the motherland. The Russian people have an enormous common identity that Americans don't have, and even Europeans don't have. Russians have it because they've had enormous suffering. For the past 100 years, they've suffered under communism and the oppression of communism. Then they were liberated by communism. And then in the 1990s, the United States totally betrayed Russia and tried to disintegrate it, largely because you have a religious intolerance of the Russian Orthodox Church that does not exist in the American Protestant circles and the American evangelical circles. It's largely existent only in the fascist religious circles, whether it's the hardline Catholic circles with a Roman Catholic obedience and hatred for anything non-Catholic, which includes the Russian Orthodox Church and the Greek Orthodox Church. But there's a rabid anti-Russian hostility I've seen in a lot of the Catholic circles. Incidentally, those hardline Catholic circles populate a lot of the American foreign policy and the American Pentagon military establishment. Now, of course, not all Catholics believe that. Some of the best people that exist on the planet are Catholics, and this is in no way to orient, the Catholics versus the Orthodox Russians. But I'm simply identifying that there are some people in very key positions in the military and the Pentagon and the foreign policy establishment of the United States and Europe, which are virulently anti-Russian because of the religious dimension. And that really is silly, and we have no place in tolerating that when we're looking to make national policies, because policies are all about being friends and trading and trusting nations. And it doesn't mean entering into super alliances and self-defense pacts. George Washington warned us against that and told us, do not get entangled with the petty feuds and differences of Europeans, because you had all sorts of feuds and frictions and conflicts and dislikes that America was immune to because of our geographical isolationism. But Europe doesn't. You've got the French, you've got the Spanish, you've got the Italians, you've got the Germans, you've got the British, you've got the English, you've got the Welsh, you've got the Scottish, you've got the Norwegians, you've got the Swedes, you've got the Finns, you've got the Russians, you've got Belarusians, you've got the Slovakians. You've got a whole salad bowl of personality and history and culture in Europe that doesn't exist in the United States. And that's one of the beautiful things about Europe, incidentally. There are so many wonderful, lovely, different flavors of culture and music and personality compared to the Irish, for example. To the Scottish and the Irish are different, but they're very similar. The Irish are different from the English, and the English have French and German connections. But we should never foolishly believe that Europe is one mass superstate, that it has the, quote, European Union as one grand Europe. That is toxic, it's false, it's a lie, it's stupid, and it is what is the old wineskin is going to be pulled apart as the new wine of the Muslim influx comes into Europe, because the old wineskins of Europe, the old European identity, is still there. It never goes away. They may be tolerant of the European Union notion, but they are not going to surrender their identity to become European. They're not European. The British are very distinct from the continental Europeans. They look at the continentals is somewhat trashy compared to the English and the Welsh and the Scottish and the Irish. The island people are different. The Norwegians and the Scandinavians, the Danish and the Swedes, they're even more different than the Continentals. So this new wine of Muslim injection into Europe, I think, is going to have a very poisonous backlash effect. I think it's going to serve almost like a adrenaline shot in the heart of Europe. If anybody's seen Pulp Fiction recognizes, you stab the adrenaline shot in the heart, the person suddenly explodes alive like never before. I think that's going to happen in Europe. And I think in that explosion, in that coming to life for the first time, they are going to quickly ally with Russia. And they're going to divorce themselves from the drunken maniac of America and the policies of American empire that have driven these Muslims up into Europe. I think Europe is very quickly going to see itself as betrayed by the United States and are going to become furious at the fact that the United States forced the European countries to surrender their arms and their freedom in exchange for the promise of protection that America would give them in the face of any communist enemies. We saw that in the late 1940s, 50s, and 60s. America went up through the CIA and elsewhere and went into Europe and built the wall and all sorts of other stuff. And in exchange for that, Europeans were promised that they were going to be safe. Well, the Americans have abandoned their post and allowed these Muslims to come marching in like a 1,000-mile Walking Dead parade procession. And it's not far from the Walking Dead. These guys are coming up with a fury and wrecking signposts and raping and pillaging and causing nothing but damage and destruction as they penetrate the heart of Europe. Now, there are good refugees. There are good women and children, of course, that have been sadly dislocated, that have had their lives and their homes and everything ruined, that need to be helped, healed, and given cover. That's our humanity side. But we do not let 1,000 people into the lifeboat, because the lifeboat simply sinks and everybody on the lifeboat dies. That's discretion, that's judgment, that's wisdom. So we do not let every single person from North Africa in the Middle East tromp up into Europe or the United States and claim to be a refugee. We don't do that. That's a betrayal against everything sane, and it's also betrayal against the whole reason why people have government in the first place. So the Europeans are very quickly going to see the United States has been instrumental in allowing these refugees to come in the country, because the United States military is responsible for the defense. They're responsible for manning the checkpoints. They're responsible for providing the intelligence reports to all of the senior political leadership in Europe to say, hey, we've got a lot of refugees that seem to be coming up. How are we going to respond to them? How are you, Germany, going to respond to this crisis? It's going to be at your door in 6 weeks. The fact that that hasn't been done is indicative of a major cover-up, a major psyop, a major corruption and betrayal of the European people, or amazing, intolerable incompetence. And I don't chalk it up out of incompetence. I chalk it up out of intelligent design, a design to murder and destroy Europe by infecting it with this, poison. It's basically taking gold that existed and mixing it with fool's gold, and the resulting metal is degenerated in its integrity. That's what this design is effectively trying to do by taking these mass hordes and moving up into Europe. Never mind the chaos that's going to ensue. Never mind the misunderstandings that will develop when you can't speak the language and you have no skills and you're a young man between 18 and 35 and all you know how to do is smoke cigarettes and treat women like cattle and hang out at your Wahhabist mosque and have your male ego groomed to say you don't have to do any manual labor. That's what women are for. You are God's chosen people. Go and breed by rape, pillage, or whatever other relationship you can cultivate and conquer Europe. That's what the Wahhabists are getting from their own psyop, from their Wahhabist cleric establishment. That's what Europeans need to understand, and that's how they need to choose. How are they going to react? I think they're going to react by going more to Russia and saying, please help us, please save us, please defend Europe. And Russia, of course, will come to the aid of it. Now, one of the first steps that needs to happen to do that is all of Europeans need to look at what Turkey just did in shooting down the Russian plane and ostracize Turkey, cut them off. They are not European, they're not German, they're not British, they're not Swedish, they're not French, they're not Scandinavian, they're Turkish. Turkish, Saudi Arabians share the same ideology, Wahhabist ideology, and that ideology is geared towards resurrecting the Ottoman Empire and destabilizing Syria and destabilizing Iran. That is what Turkey wants. That's what Saudi Arabia wants. That's what Kuwait wants. That's what Qatar wants. That is not an ally of Europe. It's not an ally of the United States, and it's not an ally of the Russian nations. So America, Europeans, and the Russian nations need to understand that and appropriately form their political policies around that belief. Mike, did you want to jump in?
Yes. The communists couldn't destroy the soul of Russia. God was merciful and allowed a spiritual renewal in Russia. And Mr. Putin got rid of the Rothschild banks. He started throwing out the oligarchs. He started fighting for Russia. He started a campaign where he could walk with impunity anywhere in Russia, and the people around him love him because he loves his nation. I respect the man. But in America, we've got degenerates running this nation. We've got people who have destroyed the moral fabric of America, who have sanctioned the child sacrifice of tens of millions of American children. We've got medicine and the medical industrial complex, which is destroying health. We've got GMO monsters destroying our food. We've got, and Russia's thrown these GMO people out. They're rejecting their counterfeit frankenfoods, but we are just doing the opposite. We just legalized the use of GMO salmon, frankenfish that have not been tested at all, but these things are not real fish. They are hybrids with other kinds of DNA in there. There's something terrible going on in America. And why does this nation now want to promote NAMBLA, the Man-Boy Love Association, North American Man-Boy Love Association? Why does Britain want to reduce the age of consent for children to 4 years old so they can have sex with old perverts? Why is this kind of thing being tolerated in a so-called Christian nation? Well, because we've rejected the commandments of God. We made it illegal to show the commandments of God in government buildings. This government has rejected the God of heaven and earth. And we're somehow thinking that the blessing of being a Christian Zionist and declaring now we're not under the law, we're under grace, so people can sin all they want, and God will continue to forgive them. This is a moral insanity. It's not found in the Bible. But America, compared to Russia, the Russian people understand integrity. You and I know some Russians. They are honorable people. They're not perverted. Now, what I see happening is because Australia and Canada and Europe has been disarmed, I believe what's happening is going to create a massive black market for getting weapons into those nations because they see what's coming. They're reading the handwriting on the wall. They understand the treason in their governments. They understand that their police have been turned into enemies of the American people. And we're seeing major changes happening. We're seeing that NATO betrayed Europe and they want order out of chaos. They're asking little towns in Germany that have maybe 120 people to accept 750 of these crazy, unrestrained people that have no willingness at all to assimilate, no willingness to work. And the German and European work ethic is totally different from what these parasites are used to. And they
Mike,
were sustained. Amen?
yeah, amen. The other thing, to mention when you're differentiating between the Russian peoples and such, it warrants another, and I know we've talked about it, but we really need to reemphasize it again. The difference between the Wahhabist and the Persian Shia and the Kurds and the Syrian Alawites, the difference between those Muslims, the Iranian Muslim, Persian, the Alawite, the Kurd, those people compared to the Wahhabi Sunni Salafist cult is as different from Rex Harrison to some half-witted, no-teeth, animal living in a deep, Arkansas bayou sort of thing. The Persian, the Alawite, the Syrian, the Kurd are very sophisticated people. They're very loyal, and they are not the Wahhabi kamikaze, beheading, rapist animal that looks to destroy everything that will not become a convert to Islam. The Wahhabist cult is destroying the historical sites in Afghanistan, in Syria. The Wahhabist cult is beheading children and mentally challenged people they come across, and going in and performing sex slavery and doing every degenerate, corrosive activity. That's the Wahhabist cult. It's not the Iranians, and it's not the Syrians, it's not the Kurds. It is the Wahhabist cult. And the Wahhabist cult needs to be exposed as the enemy of the United States it is, and the enemy of Western civilization it is, and the enemy of the Russian and the Chinese people. That's the Wahhabist cult. I saw this firsthand in military training when all these Saudi Arabian Wahhabists were infecting the American military mind with all sorts of propaganda. I saw it firsthand when they were in Georgetown and George Washington University and the university establishments near Washington, D.C. The Wahhabists were infecting the educational institutions. I saw it also, and we see it recently, when the Wahhabists are offering to pay and build 200 mosques in Europe. Rather than build 200 mosques in Saudi Arabia for those refugees to be housed in, they're looking to penetrate and seed and capture areas of Europe. So Europeans and Americans need to be very smart very quickly in differentiating and discriminating between the Wahhabist Sunni Salafist cult and the Shia Kurd Alawite Muslim. And it also the Sunni moderates, the Sunni who do not subscribe to the Wahhabist mentality, the Takfiri ideology, the Mufsidun, un-Islamic behaviors of the Wahhabists. But the Sunnis and the Shia and the Kurds and the Alawites need to make it a very clear and uncompromising communication campaign that they do not and will not tolerate, and would be the first people in the line of humanity to kill any of these Wahhabist violent aggressors before it becomes an all-out us versus them war. And we see, and that causes nothing but a police state. We see that, as you just mentioned, in Europe, the falling into a police state mentality with this French attack has suddenly spread up into Belgium, and now it's spreading elsewhere, where the Europeans are getting familiar and acclimated to armed military on all the corners with automatic machine guns, supposedly to protect against future Paris attacks. That is coming to the United States. It's already been tried and launched through the United States, but the next stage is about to happen, most likely in Chicago or Washington or New York, where you've got large groups of black populations black populations that are being stirred up and animated and frothed up by CIA operations. I know firsthand CIA examples of CIA agents going into low class communities, low rent communities, minority communities, and handing out guns out of the back of cars. I think you had talked a little bit about that, Mike, before too. So the CIA have a history of fomenting instability for a variety of reasons. And of course, I've seen it firsthand in the deep black educational psyop that's been done, where the Department of Justice has been forcing prisoners and inmates to go through a brainwashing class where they have taught them deep black, the history of the United States CIA, Mossad drug running operations and assassination operations for the past 50 years. What that has done is taken men who have gotten out of prison after 20, 30 years, lost everything, lost their families, lost their wives, lost their children, lost their parents, lost their home, come out of jail with nothing but clothes on their back, then put them through this training and said, you've been in jail and lost everything because the CIA are in charge of gun running and drug operations. The CIA and Mossad, Israel, have been in charge of this. That's what they've taught inmates. And now these inmates, after learning this, ask yourself, what is their attitude going to be towards the United States government, towards police, towards the CIA, towards anything that claims to have authority over people in a government capacity? When these citizens have been taught that their government has been engaged in murder, drug trafficking operations, and unconstitutional illegal activity, and yet hypocritically thrown them in prison for a minor infraction or a drug trade, when the government has been doing it and the agencies of the intelligence, CIA, have been doing it. What's that going to do to the individual prisoner? And all you need is one. It's going to turn them into Frankenstein kamikazes that will now make their entire identity and life's mission while they breathe to destroy everything that resembles the government apparatus or the intelligence apparatus or anything of law and order. And that'll translate into incendiary moments of riots or shooting police officers or things like that. So it's striking that the government has been teaching this class, psychologically manipulating inmates to prepare them for future activities that may be arising from increasing unstable America, economic disruption that we may have, or another all-out false flag. You could very easily have a major shooting event similar to Paris or the Mumbai attacks in Chicago, in Philadelphia, in East Coast. I think it'll be somewhere in the East Coast. It won't be in the Midwest. It may be in California, but it would probably be the East Coast corridor because it's the easiest to get in, blow some things up, and then get out quickly. Washington, especially, is one of the easiest places to launch attacks. Mike, did you want to jump in?
Yes, brother. I'm wondering if the city, or rather the Nation of Islam, hasn't been promoting the kind of religion where attacking whitey is becoming something that they're looking for with respect to their own mindset about the supposed oppression of black people in America. And I'm wondering, who was that Islamic cleric you quoted that was talking about the fact that people that commit the crimes that ISIS is committing would be immediately thrown down into hell?
Yeah, well, that's a very good point. I'm glad you reminded me of that. I recalled when I was at the State Department and at Special Operations Command, I worked with the best people in psychological warfare. I worked with men of integrity and people that were academic and that were serious about winning the hearts and minds because they had been led into believe that these savages had crashed into our buildings. So I worked with Colonel Jones and others who were creating psychological warfare, strategic communications, information operations to penetrate the hearts and minds of the enemy, Wahhabist. And we laid out extensive material. Some are classified, some are not. But the unclassified that I can say is we targeted the Muslim Brotherhood. We targeted the Muslim Brotherhood from origin to end and everything that was associated with it. And we presented it to the Bush administration and the highest levels of the military apparatus as the #1 bullseye that we needed to take down, the Muslim Brotherhood. And that was the core of the Wahhabist origin. And the Bush administration shelved it, didn't do anything with it, just preferred to go on this silly public relations campaign that somehow democracy and capitalism would replace the religious impulse in these Middle Eastern people who've never had capitalism besides, trading goats in a bazaar or camels. The only thing they've had is their local expressions of capitalism. And the only other thing they have is Islam, their whole identity, their whole culture, their whole existence is bound together in that religious amusement park of Islam. So we went into this. We went into the Bush administration, presented it. It was never acted upon. It was thrown out. The people who were developing this were targeted and kicked out of their jobs, thrown out. Individuals that I've mentioned in the past, Mike Furlong, Colonel Jeff Jones. I won't mention a few others because they don't want necessarily to be exposed, but they were all targeted and abused. And then when the Obama administration came in, they were prosecuted. The Obama administration, which has a love for the Muslim Brotherhood, love for the Wahhabist mentality, they came in and attacked those who were attacking the Wahhabist ideology. And we were doing it for the American citizen. Obama and his Nazi Gestapo types came in and attacked us because they wanted to empower the Wahhabist Muslim Brotherhood. And we've seen that in his 8 years. We've seen nothing but strengthening of the Brotherhood, strengthening of the Wahhabist impulse. So the Obama administration has done exactly the opposite of what we were paid to attack and destroy. So what does that tell you? The American president has attacked and tried to destroy us because we were previously attacking and destroying the enemies of the United States of America. That means the president is the enemy of the United States of America. It's very simple. But that was proven again, as you mentioned, Mike. We were extrapolating a lot of the ideas and legal discussion from Saeed Imam, who was a Muslim scholar, lawyer, who was very clear in laying out the Islamic Hadith Sunnah matrix and filtering every action by the Wahhabist, Al-Qaeda, ISIS type, filtering their actions through this matrix out of a desire to protect Muslims from falling into damnation. It's not because he loved the United States or Western civilization. It's because he loved his people more. So Saeed Imam was putting forth a matrix of very high caliber legal and cultural and religious filtration mechanisms, and we were using that to construct our own strategic communication and presenting it to the highest levels of the military intelligence apparatus, saying this is what will work. This is what will destroy the enemies of the United States and separate the extremists from the moderates. And it's not us saying it, it's Muslim scholars and Muslim legal experts and people that have a love for their people. They don't have a love for conquest. They don't have a hatred for the United States. They have a love for their people. All they care about is their people not being led astray on a cult, religious, rabbit trail, similar to the cult in San Diego that in 1998 or 1999 all committed suicide because the comet was coming along the sky. You remember that? Heaven's Gate, that's what they were called, the Heaven's Gate cult. Well, the Saudi Arabian Wahhabist cult of Wahhabism, that's the equivalent of the Heaven's Gate cult. Let's be very clear. And we were identifying it that way and presenting it. And all of that was rejected. It was shut down. There were a lot of neoconservative, Jewish, Israeli Mossad sympathetic types that were in there, in the State Department, in the military, that in a very baffling way rejected all of that material that would have worked.
Brother, they got rid of you. They threw you in prison. Jeff Jones was mysteriously killed. And the reality is everything this government has done since then has been an act of terror and war against the free peoples in the world. Everything that they've been doing has been linked to genocide. We've got a monster in the Blight House who has murdered more people with drones than any other president. And it's only maybe 1 in every 10 people he's murdered were the so-called target. The rest were collateral damage. We're dealing with a monster, a demonized felon who has committed so much treason, he could have been put to death almost a decade ago for what he's done. And America needs to wake up. The reality is sometimes it just takes a few people to stand up. And my own conviction is this. The best I can offer is this, that there are things that the real America stands for that are worth fighting for, they are worth dying for, and real Americans and real men will understand exactly what you and I are talking about. Over to you, brother.
Yeah, without a doubt. So I wanted to bring in there the history of the Wahhabist exposure and PSYOP that we were engaging in, and the President of the United States, Obama, openly attacking the people that had been previously paid to analyze the enemies of the United States and their belief system. So where we are now is we've got Russia sending ships and increasing its military defense posture against Turkey because Turkey has stabbed it in the back. Turkey has shot down one of its planes, and its pilots were shot at. One was killed when they were descending in a parachute. Never mind the Geneva Convention. It basically goes without saying the Wahhabist savages have no respect for the Geneva Convention. Only Germans and French and Europeans and Americans do. We were the ones who constructed that Geneva Convention. That is an alien concept to these people. So the Russians have now assumed a posture of war preparation, and Turkey is trying to, like a little yelping Chihuahua dog, is barking at Russia with the hope that the NATO Mastiff will come up behind it and protect it. And I don't think it should happen. I don't think it will happen. I think Europeans are going to look at Turkey and say, you are a bunch of savage idiots for taking out a Russian plane that you knew was doing counterterrorism operations. And you're hypocrites, incidentally, because the Syrian or the Turkish president, Erdogan, had previously said when one of Turkey's planes was shot down by President Assad, Turkey said a plane crossing over into another airspace should not be the pretext for a shoot down. It should not be brought down. So that was the Turkish president saying that and then doing exactly the opposite against Russia. Never mind the fact that Turkish airplanes have been flying sorties over Greece, violating Greek airspace. Never mind that Turkey has been allowing Israeli planes to come up and bomb Syria using Turkish airspace. Turkey is the epitome of an obscene hypocrite. And now psychologically, from a psychological warfare campaign perspective, you look at Turkey and you look at, well, what does Erdogan believe? He believes in the Ottoman Empire. He wants to present himself as the next grand leader of the caliphate eventually. And Syrian President Assad has said the Turkish president is a maniac, and he believes and follows all the Wahhabi text and books and belief system. So Turkey and the Saudi Gulf nations believe the same thing, and that is to rape, pillage, kill, and destroy, or convert the rest of the world. That's not Iran. That's not Kurds. That's not Assad. That's not Syria. That's only the Wahhabi Salafist Islamic mentality. So Turkey is now positioning itself to be the receiver of a Russian counteroffensive. How Russia does it, it needs to split away the Europeans from NATO. It needs to reorganize NATO. It needs to have a Morning in America Again campaign where it advertises to the American people and the European people. You know, in the 1980s, we were a world at peace. Ronald Reagan, the Russians, Europe were all basically stable, and the Middle East was stable. You had strong men and strong military sort of controllers, but the Middle East personality was contained within its own window of operations. Now you've got the Middle East flooding into Europe. That's not Russia's doing, that's America's doing. Are you safer now than you were 20 years ago? No. Are you better now? No. Are you richer now? No. Are you going to be? No. Because all of these Middle Eastern Wahhabi Muslim refugees that are coming up into Europe because of George Soros and John Kerry and President Obama and Hillary Clinton and these clowns in the Pentagon and these clowns in the CIA and the intelligence sectors, they've allowed them, they've pushed them up into Europe. Now Europe is at a crossroads. Do you allow that to continue, or do you stop it, push it back, and push out any of the nations that have been facilitating this? If you want to preserve old Europe, then you need to side with Russia. If you want to surrender and destroy old Europe, then you side with the United States. What is your choice, European? What do you want? Old Europe to survive? Christian Europe to survive? Or do you want to destroy old Europe and destroy Christian Europe and become a Muslim Europe? It's your choice, but you can't have it both ways. Either you go with Russia or you go with the United States. There's a great scene in King Kong, if you recall. Naomi Watts has just fallen out of the tree, and King Kong is on one side and the Tyrannosaurus Rex is on the other. And Naomi Watts is looking up at each one and saying, who do I go to? Do I go to King Kong, or do I go into the jaws of death? And you've got the Tyrannosaurus Rex, which is consumed with nothing but eating and its reptilian instincts. And you've got King Kong, that's a scary sight, but has a brain and has an affection. And Naomi Watts chooses King Kong. And that's Europe. Europe is the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Naomi Watts. That's the Swedes, that's the Germans, that's the Celts. And where are they going? Do they go into the compassionate arms of a big Russian mystery and Russian gorilla? We'll call it a bear. Or do they go into the reptilian, mindless jaws of the Tyrannosaurus Rex America, George Soros, and the obsessive Wahhabist cult? It's a very simple choice. And as for me in my house, I think I'd go more into the Russian protection, where there's an affection and there's some brains and intelligence, rather than be completely devoured and destroyed by the reptilian hedonism and narcissism and materialism of the American Western experiment, where you have homosexuality rampant, gay marriage rampant, drugs and sickness, and a Western medical establishment that is it's on its last breaths. And it saddens me to have to say all of that, but I'm not going to mince words, and I'm not going to hold anything back, because we are in a life or death situation as a human society, a human global society. And either we are smart enough to figure it out and choose the lesser of evils, or we are stupid and careless and we just allow ourselves to be consumed. And it is coming to a point where humanity, I think, is going to begin separating into more tribal factions and belief associations, and that's going to be it's going to manifest in the United States. We already see that in some states. separating from the national identity and the national agenda. We already saw that in the 30 governors rejecting the Syrian refugee entrance into the United States. That's instant civil war, with the 30 governors saying you will not send refugees into this state of North Carolina or Texas or Louisiana. That's civil war. It's legal. It's perfectly legal, and it's constitutional for a governor to say to President Obama, you will not send a super tanker full of Muslim refugees into my state. You're not going to unconstitutionally violate the rights of my citizens to be secure in their homes and their persons. You're not going to aid and abet the enemy of the United States by letting them come in here without me and my governor and my citizens deciding how and why it's done. No, not a single boat, not a single car, not a single airplane is going to bring anybody into the state unless our citizens in this state determine it and determine how it's going to be done, if at all.
The treasonous government, the Federals, in their treason, have willingly opened up the gates of this nation and allowed this murderous Trojan horse to start coming in. And Americans must say no, no more. We need to ask for God's help now. This is not about religion. This is about calling on God, who created all of us. If people have faith, it reminds me of the people in the book of Jonah. They were all calling on their God, and then they asked Jonah, why don't you? He said, well, I'm running away from the God who made everything, including the ocean. But they found out that Jonah represented the true God. And when they threw him in the ocean and the fish swallowed him and the ocean all of a sudden became calm, then they converted and they said, the Lord, he is God. And we need God to show us who he is, the true God, to help us to resist evil. And so I'm thinking this should be how we could end our program, in asking God to help America in this season, because like I said before, it's been part of the plan of the New World Order to use precious things, celebrations like a Thanksgiving Christian celebration, as an opportunity for them to bring into America some terror operation that they themselves have financed and brought into America.
Yeah, let me just close it out, Mike, and then you can close us out in prayer. That the thing that everyone should do is go out into their community and own their community, own their city hall, own their high schools, own their junior highs, own their churches, own their women's clubs, and all the institutions of the local community that make
the sheriffs,
and the sheriffs and the emergency services. Engage those institutions and be connected with those institutions, and do it in teams. Don't do it as lone individuals, but you have to have teams, because that doubles your power and your influence. But that's essential to protecting your community and growing your community, and recognizing, what we are talking about doing is preserving the life and life abundantly and safety. And everyone wants to exist in a 1950s country and world where kids can go out and play ball and don't have to worry about being abducted or raped or pornography rampant on the internet, or violence and degeneracy. We want instinctively to live in a country of peace, but to do that requires the exposure of the criminal elements and the deceivers and the liars who are actively promoting the police state, and they're promoting the police state through energizing the terrorist, mercenary, ISIS, Al-Qaeda type threat. That's a false threat, but they are committed to doing that. Christians and non-Christians need to engage the Muslim institutions and people and hold them to a very solid litmus test, but they need to overcome the psyop that's been perpetrated against them, where every Muslim is an enemy. That doesn't win us the wars. That doesn't win us the conflict, especially when you look at the population numbers and and all sorts of other things. That's what Europe is starting to shake from. We need to ally with the good and isolate the fanatical bad, the extremist types. So, I'll stop it there and say one of the things I reflected on before we came down and started this was this is the time of year that you have the most beautiful handcrafted paintings of nature throughout the year. You've got the colors of the trees, autumn, the crispness of the air, the scent of wood fireplaces, the assembling of family, and the tradition, and the warm cinnamon scented homes and Christmas wreaths. You have the preparation of celebration, and it's a beautiful time for human expressions of love and truth. And that is what we're fighting for and protecting and advancing, is the protection of love and truth and family and tradition. So use that as the justification to be fearless and fight. Mike, I'll let you close us out and end us with a prayer.
Scott, it's always an honor to communicate what you and I have been given agreement about. It's always an honor to stand alongside you, because God has made you a man of conviction. He's allowed you to go through that fiery trial when this wicked government threw you in prison because you started speaking the truth in Central Command. And God honored me by allowing me to have our friendship. And Father in heaven, we thank you for real friends. We thank you for opportunities to love our families. We thank you, Father, also for opportunities to pray for our enemies by believing in your love and your forgiveness. Like you said, there is forgiveness with you, Lord, that you may be feared. We're praying, Father, for your mercy to triumph over judgment. We're praying for your will in America and in Europe. We're praying, Father, for love to overcome hatred and for goodness to overcome evil. We're praying, Father, for your protection, Lord, in all the earth, and for an outbreak of mercy and kindness and real understanding, which is not weakness. Lord, we understand that there is true evil in the world, and we're asking for your will in the lives of those who seek that kind of evil. We're praying for your will, not their will, and not the will of the demonic entities that motivate these people. We're praying, Lord, have mercy on us. Expose the works of darkness. We pray, Lord, move in America and move in the world, and give us peace that comes from the one who you raised from the dead, the one who is the true Prince of Peace. And we thank you for this through Christ our Savior. Amen.